promises to be quite a, I guess, broad and diverse kind of session, because what we're trying to do is to draw out some perspectives from industry, government and academia around this whole problem of cybersecurity, and in particular looking at the area of finance and the financial industry and the financial ecosystem. So what we really want to try and do is explore what the issues are on cybersecurity in that particular domain, and then try and figure out, I suppose, what each one of these strands of this triple helix, the industry, government and academia, could bring to the problem. And we're very lucky with the panel because we've got people here who have experience in many cases in more than one of those domains. And so hopefully we'll be able to explore this topic. It might be something that we'll have to draw together at the end, but I'm hoping that we'll have a nice wide range of discussion. And don't forget the Slido questions as we go through. So what I'm going to do is actually just ask everyone if they might introduce themselves. Very briefly, though, we've got Philip Bond here from CST. He'll explain what that is in a minute. Then Doug Orr, who's founder and chief executive officer of Novastone. Chris Gibson, who is the chief information security officer at Close Brothers. Sorry, we've stopped. And then, not at the end, but one from the end, Dr. PJ Beaton, who is a colleague of mine from Imperial College. So maybe if we could start, Chris, with you, with just a brief sort of intro about your background.
My background.
Yeah.
So my name, as introduced, Chris Gibson. I am the CISO at Close Brothers, which is a merchant bank, about 3,000 people, mainly based in the UK. I guess when I do these things, why I think you should listen to me, and that's completely your call. But prior to that, I spent 3 years running the National CERT. So that was very involved in bringing academia, industry and government together to try and build a better world in terms of the response to an incident. That's since been taken up into the National Cybersecurity Centre. I think Kieran Martin was here this morning talking about that. So we were one of the precursor organisations for that. So I sort of sat on the critical national infrastructure side. Prior to that, I spent 19 years at Citibank, and now I'm back in finance. So I can see a number of the focus areas in this.
I'm PJ Beaton. I've worked about 30 years in investment banking as a quant trader and head trader. Then ran my own hedge fund for 12 years, heavily focusing on electronic trading. And then in the last few years, I have a part-time involvement at Imperial College, setting up a FinSec research activity, which involves primarily, in the context of today's discussions, identifying vulnerabilities in financial institutions, especially at the more complex end, where, for instance, an attacker could come in and create a massive number of orders for disruption or financial gain.
So I'm Douglas Orr. I am honored to be here because I think I represent the smallest organization on this panel. That's my fate as an entrepreneur. I've been building businesses for 22 years, starting in Norway a long time ago, and usually to do with, the first one was about infrastructure, second one is not, and this one is about providing a chat platform, for lack of a better word, for enabling collaboration between financial institutions and their clients in retail, corporate, private, and investment banking, internal and external, supporting GDPR, supporting FINMA, creating a safe space to save costs and enable collaboration. It's been a lot of fun. We're one of those companies that is enjoying being in the right place at the right time, but it is challenging. I guess that's one of the reasons we're on the panel, to work with large financial institutions.
Excellent. Hello, everybody. I'm Professor Philip Bond, and I sit on the Council for Science and Technology, which is the Prime Minister's Advisory Council for all matters on science and technology. And I worked for a long time in finance, and I also work in other areas as well. So I'm very interested in things like blockchain and cryptography, and also the financial system. So I was one of the lead experts on the government's work into computer-driven trading, where we had about 300 experts around the world coming in and looking at the implications of computer-driven trading and high-frequency trading. And those areas have just grown like Topsy ever since we reviewed them.
Fantastic. So I think just to kick off, I wondered whether each of you could also just maybe tell us a bit about, from your perspectives, what you see the major cybersecurity issues might be in the financial industry, maybe based on your experience or what you've seen emerging over the last few years. And maybe I'll start again with you, Chris, on the end.
So I think I would say the major issue is the sheer complexity and the sheer interrelationship of the finance sector. So we have that sort of butterfly in the forest thing where something over here ripples across and you're never quite sure where it's going to go. Coming out of Citibank, where I worked before, 200 global organisation, I don't think anyone really had their finger on the no one had their finger on the I know how all these systems hang together and what I do over there is going to affect over there. If you then multiply that across the whole of an economy, that's enormously worrying. Government certainly doesn't understand that at the level of detail that it needs to fix it. I mean, in my experience when I worked inside the government was that. It was very much we need to partner with you, industry, so we can help you understand what we see the threats are, but you need to be helping us as to what you see your threats are and your fixes are. So that was I would say, the complexity.
And do you think, just picking up on that, the issue of this came up earlier on, I think, as well, the nature of interconnectivity and the complexity of that and mapping it being a difficult thing. I think there was an example with the London Tube map earlier on. What are the ramifications, you think, then, for understanding risk if that kind of...
Well, again, hugely, hugely challenging. We can, as humans, we can understand volcano risk, land, an earthquake risk. If you're in San Francisco, every 100 years there'll be an earthquake. I can get that. The level of complexity that you have and the level of lack of understanding of how the systems connect means that can turn on a dime. You can wake up in the morning and WannaCry's here and your systems are down. You were safe today, you're not safe tomorrow. That level of complexity is enormously challenging for a chief exec who understands ordinary risk and FX risk and all the other ones. That's very, very difficult for them to get.
Right. PJ, you want to pick anything up?
Yeah, I mean, coming from the hedge fund industry, I hear a lot about the problems that big corporations face in terms of what the board should be doing and not be doing, and typically it's not taking action early enough or investing in systems. I've faced, in my industry, the opposite problem is that the chief executives happen to also be the head traders and principals in a hedge fund that can have only 3 or 4 principals and yet trade 40 billion pounds worth of securities at any, in an hour. So from that point of view, the lack of securing the infrastructure to outside attack there, because too much action has been taken in terms of improving the speed at which you send your orders to the market, and it's where picoseconds are coming next, with quantum computing and so on, and locating all your servers next to the exchanges. That pressure on technology, which is not something you find in a bigger financial institution as much, or at least it's only a smaller proportion of the overall revenues. But here, in a hedge fund that trades actively in the markets, if you cannot trade fast, you have a problem. So there, you have less time to detect the problem, and Philip also knows a lot about it, and as he was the co-author of Computer Trading in the UK. So that's what intrigued me, and we started this effort at the Imperial College, is to be able to come up with early detection tools that will allow us, allow the order generators, what may be a hedge fund or proprietary trading organization, to intercept orders if they have been generated, from hacking. So for me, it's that sort of race to speed in trading that and leaving the security issues sort of further behind.
And that's a trend you see will just continue. I mean, the way things work at the moment, and also does that pressure, I guess what you're saying is, doesn't allow people to stop to think about whether or not their implementations are secure, right? Because you're in a foot race with everyone else to try and be faster.
Yes, and even you see some of the head traders trading from the beach, and still sending big orders. So there's a massive amount of compromise, of potential backdoor security issues there. And I really, you don't have the chief You don't have a CISO, you don't even have a CTO in most cases, and the same people who are making the decisions in terms of taking a lot of risk and investing in 10% of a company, in a takeover, are the ones that are also making the decisions on technology.
So there is a significant chance then, I think, just to illustrate it to people, that the risk in this situation, or the threat is it could be that you've still got vulnerable points which could create very large impacts. And then relating back to what you said earlier on, it sounds like we're not really sure then exactly what the extent of the impacts might be.
It's a challenge.
And so into this whole mix comes the whole sort of fintech revolution, I guess, and the idea that SMEs, Doug, will save the day and invent our economy out of all of these problems. How do you see that fitting in as somebody who lives and breathes that every day?
It's such a fascinating world. I mean, we're very narrowly focused on communication and how people engage with each other around the world. And the challenges which our clients and prospects face are email is just not, I remember when 7 years ago my banker wouldn't accept email instructions anymore, and every instruction resulted in a callback, which meant the friction went from here to here. And back to the previous speaker in the last panel talking about people moving away from that, I did about that much less work with that banker, which is a threat to that business model. And then you see, because I live in the world of chat, we work with clients around the world, and particularly in Asia, the widespread adoption of chat, WhatsApp and WeChat in particular, for business as well as and being used in banking, and communication is a real challenge about, well, where is this data stored? Who owns this data? Who controls this data? And it's usually not the banks. So it's a very interesting space, and unfortunately it's often a very reactive situation with the clients we work with.
And do you see security as being, or cybersecurity being a domain in which sort of you see funding for fintech activity? I mean, it seems to me there's a lot of money around sort of evolving bank services and functionality for the main core of the business, but FinSec as an area inside that fintech kind of domain.
Well, there is. I think UK is one of the recognized global centers of fintech and security, and happily they both exist here. And there is, I think, good funding for your talented students coming out of the various universities and people, experienced veterans, to start businesses at an angel level. Maybe not. Maybe that's not Chris. But I think what is a risk, and we discussed this beforehand, was there's a huge funding gap in the UK, which doesn't exist in America at all, really, between people building a product, being able to prove the product, and having the funding to then support the engagement with the marketplace. So many banks I know have these fintech accelerators, and if you know these things, you enter with an idea, and 90 days later they kick you out into the big world. Well, there's no sales cycle with any bank that I know of that is 90 days for anything like this. So you have this incredible mismatch between the ambition of banks to engage with exciting new technology emerging from young whippersnapper, young people, and the ability of banks to absorb these technologies.
I like that you were looking at the end there when you said whippersnapper, because you were saying...
Yeah, I'm the oldest guy in the panel.
That's what you were saying earlier on. So maybe, Philip, then how does government play into this discussion that we're just having there? It sounds to me that we've got the large industry view. There's obviously, there seem to be issues here, right? There's vulnerabilities that could cause massive impacts. People think, I suppose, the fintech community and that startup area is going to help to solve the problems. And what's government's view for helping to deliver these solutions?
I can't necessarily talk for government, but I'll talk for myself with perhaps some background in understanding how government look at this. And so I think the first thing is that first thing to say is that I think the Bank of England in particular has actually been very proactive in recognising for a long time that these are challenges and that they need to stress test the system. A lot of utilities are not that we have simply, or critical national infrastructure, are not stress tested in the same ways that banking systems are. But I think some of the core issues we have. The first one is scaling. So very, very large organisations have a scaling problem, which often is translated into having thousands of disparate systems, as was alluded to earlier, which are often with legacy and where the systems engineering of those things is poorly understood. So that's a very bad scale at which to be operating. It's extremely difficult to lock those things down. Then SMEs are often operating at a scale that's so low that, as PJ says, they just don't have the basics in place to do these things. It's not their focus of their business. So that's a bad scale to be at. I'm somewhat optimistic that in between, going forward, some of the problems we have now with cybersecurity will go away with extremely efficient, very high security clouds. I mean, there's some very good cloud technologies now, but you're looking at a lot of these organizations are very far from being able to fully adopt these very high, relatively high security methods. One can argue on and on about that, but I think that things, in some ways things can get better, but one immediately is faced with two issues. If you think about cybersecurity a little bit like viruses attacking any organism, if you get a virus, probably what happens is some of your cells die, but you're fine. The organism, you, survives usually. The problem of attacks in finance is that if one cell gets infected, it can kill you, in effect. So one very small hedge fund going rogue at the wrong time in a market that's stressed could almost certainly cause a flash crash, I would imagine. It wouldn't be very hard to imagine that you could do that. And so you have a very a sensitivity, if you like, to these things that's very difficult. So I think the view is that we need to continue and broaden the stress testing of these institutions, and we need to drive understanding of security matters throughout the system, from the SMEs right the way through to the very large systems. So one of the things I would like to see, now we have the National Cybersecurity Centre in place, there is a lot of deep expertise in academia, in government, in industry, and use that new organisation which confront people, can put people together either with high levels of classification or no levels of classification in one place, get them to actually create something like an accelerator centre where people doing fintech can go and actually work with security experts and learn how to code in a secure way, for example, because that's simply frequently not how people work right now. They have an idea in fintech, they want it to go out, and they're not thinking about the security. That should be baked in the code.
And is that still an alive problem? Because you had the same problem in physical security, where the community that could possibly offer the solutions, because we can see that, as I said from the talks this morning, you can see the sort of escape velocity of this problem is high, right? So you have to keep up with the threat space, keep up with the evolution of these networks. Is there enough access to the actual problems for the communities who might be able to solve it? You know, the academics or the SMEs, all of that sort of stuff. Are there mechanisms in place for them to be able to see those problems? Because I know in physical security that used to be a huge problem.
Yeah, it remains a huge problem because a lot of these things like vulnerabilities are obviously extraordinarily sensitive, and people don't want to necessarily share them, so they can only share in an extremely trusted environment. So there have to be scales at which you share information, but at the same time, one of the core issues is simply that vast numbers of systems in the past have had security as a bolt-on to them, and the systems engineering has been highly inadequate. So they slap in lots of systems, chuck out some legacy, but not everything. That kind of way of thinking about things needs to change. And the way you start to change that is by getting people in and learning to think about the security structure and the systems engineering of security.
Are we training them badly in our universities? Is that what you're saying?
I don't think it's about training badly, but I think that it's a question of the focus that people who are coding have and organizations have. If banks, for example, hire in lots of people to come in as consultants, essentially, and then write lots of code for them. And they'll write what they're asked to write. And they need to be told on day one, they need to have learned to think about secure coding. Very often it's something that people haven't focused on. I think that hasn't been deeply driven in as part of the education. It's getting a lot better, and so on and so forth. So there's many scales at which we need to work, and the key for government, I think, is to ensure two things. First, that people who do need to be brought together, who don't normally talk together, have a forum for doing it. And I would hope the new National Cybersecurity Centre could amongst other places, do that. Yeah. And secondly, to really drive this educational thinking much more deeply into what's being done, particularly in the fintech sector, because that's booming and that's wonderful. And the digital sector. Yeah. Digital is 7% of GVA in the country. It's growing 2.8 times faster in job creation, twice as fast as the rest of the economy. So if that continues, even for a few years, we're talking about 10% of your economy. So you better hope people are thinking about security on day one when they write any piece of code.
Brilliant. And I mean, you know, to paraphrase the President of the United States, who knew that healthcare was so complicated? I mean, with the whole sort of WannaCry crisis, you said something about the legacy systems, and you painted a picture which sounded very similar to what probably many parts of the NHS looks like right now. So I wanted to ask one of the other panel members, though, I mean, for anybody to pick up, do we feel that even at that level, with that kind of threat, is the financial industry just waiting for its WannaCry moment? And given the consequences, is it appropriate to wait? Because I think many people would consider that recent incident to be an exposure, or a very public exposure, of a problem that people knew existed for quite some time.
So we did not, touch wood, get burnt by WannaCry, and that's about the varying levels of protection we have in place. So patching is one thing, and back at City, I think we used to say an emergency patch was a month. That was the time frame we would. That was a true, oh my God, we need to install this really fast. It was a month. I think we need to very much look at that, and that's got to be ramped up. But then it's about the other levels of protection you put in. It's about your firewalls, it's about segmenting your networks. It's all the good hygiene stuff that, frankly, we should all be doing anyway as part of our daily job. It's a wake-up call to say, are we doing that right? Are we genuinely doing that properly? Many cases, I don't think we are. That's where I sit on that one.
So you think a similar kind of, because I mean, you could argue it was a fairly crude kind of incident, but a similar kind of crude incident could impact this kind of industry, I mean.
So it hasn't yet, you know. I spent 3 years doing this, and you know, touch wood, didn't happen on my watch. Very happy about that. Yeah. It's an interesting one, you know. We worry about that, but then we look at our threat and we defend in a number of ways. The NHS is I hesitate to say, a bucket of petrol waiting for a match. It's a really complex environment. It's very fragmented. There's no governance. It's devolved. It's da-da-da-da-da-da. There's a number of reasons why that was really bad, and I don't think that was.
Well, I would say it wasn't a wake-up call. The Cabinet Office publicly produced papers that they addressed to the trusts.
But I mean,
for a number of years, saying you absolutely must do the following things, or awful consequences are inevitable, and those things were clearly not done in many cases. So I'm not a big fan of the wake-up call, you know, being something terrible happening. And you know, will people learn from these things? Who knows? I think it needs to be sorted much earlier. And in finance, I would be the last to say that we want some wake-up call. Take the flash crash in the US. So the market goes down, loses $1 trillion and bounces back. Note the bounce back. What if it doesn't bounce back? What if it's $2 trillion? You really don't want to find out that something bad happened, right, the hard way, because actually you might then have, you know, 6 years of your economy's not working in the West because something awful happened. No, let's fix it first would be my very strong preference.
Agreed. Okay, sorry, PJ.
I also think that, you know, coming back to the theme that I mentioned earlier, I think a lot of time is spent in the industry, in the cybersecurity industry, in looking at broad attacks. You know, say call it low impact per victim, but large scale.
That kind of ransomware thing, hit everybody and get a bit from everyone.
And not much is understood, partially because of the complexity of the issues, you know, and Philip very eloquently alluded to that. So if you think about what happened, you know, this has nothing to do with cyber. Someone put options on Dortmund Football Club shares and then put explosives next to the bus in order to gain financial gain from hurting the team. So now take this in a context where they've, you know, the perpetrators have opened accounts in some jurisdiction away from, you know, from not in a very regulated jurisdiction, bought a lot of put options in the S&P and any shares, and then went into a hedge fund, either physical or cyber physical or cyber attack, and forced, you know, created massive number of orders. That, you know, so the financial gain potential is there because it's not just the disruption, because obviously the disruption and havoc they can cause in the system. That's in itself obviously massive, but also there's very well documented ways of gaining financial gain, having a financial gain out of that. So that's why I think that's my only issue, that when we hear about cybersecurity, not much is focused on single high impact attacks.
Yeah.
So
I'm watching the clock. So I think we're going to take some of the questions from Slido. So we've got a couple of questions. I'm not sure if there's more to come, but let's go with the top one here. So we've got Ruby asking, are regulatory sandboxes effective in bridging security and new technology effectively before full-fledged adoption? So I guess, yeah.
I'll say something from the fintech industry. Congratulations to the FCA, recognized as probably being the leading regulator in the world today and most forward-thinking from technology perspective, putting together a sandbox for new fintech companies to test their ideas on real data sets in a controlled environment. Full credit to them. It's been copied around the world. Is it a, like security, is it a destination? No, it's a journey, and I would suggest that there is obviously room to bring in some of the concepts which you've been speaking of to that sandbox.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, if I can just jump in on that, I think exactly. I think that when I was also a co-author on the Royal Society's Cyber Security Review, one of the recommendations we had was to expand these programs with a view to having things like these sandboxes and enabling people to go in. The great question is, what are you doing in the sandbox? If you go in a sandbox or some accelerator and what you're doing is trying to come up with your clever fintech idea, but you're ignoring this security aspect of it, you're just creating potentially a lot more problems. So I guess my key focus here is to say, and I'm not just talking about the SMEs that are addressing specifically cybersecurity problems. I'm saying if firms are going in sandboxes, then drive secure programming in as part of what they have to do in the sandbox as a requirement would be a really, really great thing to be doing.
I just want to follow up on that. When I started building my business 3 years ago, I went to the FCA before we did any coding. I said, what do you want us to capture? How do you want to see this data when we expose it? And nobody had ever come to them before saying, you want advice from us, and they weren't prepared for it. The sandbox came afterwards. And we went to people, Dr. Piper and others on encryptology. We did a lot of research on that stuff. But I would hope that the institute like the one you're describing would be a place we could go to where we're starting today to get some of that guidance, which we couldn't find in a structured way back then.
Exactly, that's what I'm recommending.
Great, yes. I like your recommendation.
Thank you.
Well, let's go to the only other question then on Slido here. So, how can you balance the different? I guess I'm going to paraphrase this a bit, because how can you balance the difference or the different confidentiality needs, I guess, of government to the citizen, the corporate to be competitive, and academia to publish research? So I guess this is kind of touching on what we were discussing earlier on, which is if it's very sensitive information, not just security sensitive information, of course, it could be IP for a corporate, it might not even be IP. I think we were talking earlier on about the fact that when you get groups of companies together to say, hey, can you share your cyber issues so that we can try and figure out as an industry how to do something better? No one really wants to be the first one to put their hands up and say, I just had so many emails stolen or whatever the case may be. So I wonder if...
If I can jump in on that. I think that firstly, it's a very hard balance, and secondly, it depends a little bit on what you're trying to discuss. So at one end, something like cryptography, which is done by government, it's done by business, so Microsoft and Intel and others have very big and very good cryptography groups, and it's done very well in academia. And those groups sometimes talk and sometimes don't. But the great thing about it is that it's quite possible for academics to publish things and then business just to pick them up and go off and run with them. And it's very, very hard to necessarily balance those things in terms of who talks where. So that's, again, why I think the National Cybersecurity Centre can play a role in doing it. But the thing about cryptography is if you create a standard like FIPS, you publish your standard and everyone can see what the standard is. The AES is a published standard. Where it's much, much harder, I think, personally, is when you have something like a set of attacks that are going on and some bank's been maybe penetrated and they want to be helpful and share that information around, but they're giving away stuff that's really sensitive. Balancing that one is much, much tougher, and clearly have to be lots of controls on who gets to see such sensitive information as what was the attack that just took out some piece of a bank.
Okay, so I think we're just about at time, but maybe we can take, there is another one, there's a very interesting question on Swift here, PJ, but maybe we can take a question from the floor, if there are any. Oh, there's one down here. And I think that will be the last one, because we're out of time.
I feel honored. Thank you very much. No. My name is Luke Vos. I'm a director of a cybersecurity company in the Netherlands. In my country, we have many triple helix organizations on cybersecurity, and in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of criticism on these organizations because they do not have a good connection with the community. So they don't know the hackers involved. And if you, I've heard you mention WannaCry a couple of times. This is also a good example where the community steps in without considering the whole triple helix. So I wanted to know, how do you ensure that you have good relations with the InfoSec community, hacking community?
Someone want to pick
Gosh,
that up?
that is an interesting one, isn't it?
We've got time for one person
back in
to
my
take it,
old
so-
world, I ran the CISP, which was our information sharing partnership, but that was very focused on business. I mean, it wasn't focused on individuals and hacking communities. And as a government organisation, that was quite difficult. I quite happily talked to them, but there were people like, "Ooh, you've got to sort of step back because as government you can't." Like, that just seems wrong to me. We do have a very good relationship with a lot of the network security folks, and there are groups of those who sit on the CISP, and they talk about it. I don't know that we'd want, if I was to bring hackers onto that system, I think there'd be quite a lot of pushback. But it is, I absolutely, it's balancing that. It's finding that balance of how can I get the information without revealing too much to them, and asking other people to divulge information on there if they knew that there were hackers on there as well. On the other hand, it was an incredibly light touch environment. To be fair, as long as someone said you were a good person, you could join. It was that level of light touch. It wasn't a deep vet security clearance. So I'm sure there was someone there.
Great. Well, look, in the interest of me making sure we stay on time, we didn't quite weave it and thread it all together, but I think we've got all the perspectives. Well, I'd like you to join me in thanking, thank me and thank